and welcome to the ASCM's The Chain Podcast. Today, we're going to dive deep into the future of our field, exploring what the next generation of supply chain management truly looks like. And I'm incredibly fortunate to have with us today Dr. Zal Phiroz. Dr. Phiroz is a distinguished professor of supply chain management and operations with faculty appointments at MSU and Harvard University. Zal is also an established expert in global supply chain practices and has held a number of positions in academic, executive, and senior management roles, including appointments at Procter & Gamble. Zal is going to share insights about the evolving landscape of global supply chain. Today, we'll unpack some additional critical topics, including the transformative role and expanding responsibility of the Chief Supply Chain Officer and the vital contributions academia in preparing our next generation, and as well as the importance of continuous professional development and certification in our field. Zal, welcome to The Chain.
It's such a pleasure to be here, Abe. Thank you so much for having me.
All wonderful. I can't wait to dive into this. One of the things I'm always interested in is how somebody found their way into supply chain management as a career. Traditionally not as easy a path to find when you and I grew up. So how did you find your way into supply chain management?
You know, it's interesting. I started with computer science. That was my academic path. I did 2 degrees in computer science at Windsor. Had no interest whatsoever in supply chain management. Truthfully, I don't even know if I really knew what a supply chain really was back when I was an undergraduate student. And after that, I went and I did an MBA. And slowly but surely, I understood what the concept was, but it never really clicked. I then went on and eventually, after I think probably 2 or 3 years out of my MBA, I started working at Procter and Gamble, and
Mhm.
everything seemed to fit together perfectly from a career perspective. In that I found a place that I was, relatively good at, and found something that I really enjoyed doing, which was interesting because I had no, academic background in supply chain management. I didn't study it up until that point. I had, never really worked in supply chains until I hit Procter and Gamble, and at that point, everything just clicked, and it was a match. And from then on, I've been supply chains have kind of taken over my life.
It's interesting when we see people come into supply chain, they really never leave once they get a feel for it. But you've worn multiple hats as a consultant, as a professor, strategist, as you pointed out for P&G. What are the roles? Which of those really influenced your thinking most about, and how do you navigate between them? What's driven you?
At Procter and Gamble, it was interesting because the hiring class that I had were comprised largely of people who had come out of an engineering degree,
Mhm.
and others who, had come out of a business degree. But the one commonality that we all shared, I think I was the only computer science grad that entered P&G at the time I did. With the one, thing that we all had in common is that we all had a mind that analyzed data and was very comfortable translating any sort of insights that we could draw into various business strategies and for the purposes of making business decisions. And so, my time at P&G was wonderful because I had the opportunity to work with some very like-minded people who, you could put in almost any scenario, and they would excel, right? The ability to analyze data and use it for the purposes of decision making. From Procter and Gamble, I went on and I did a lot of consulting work.
Mhm.
And in my roles, there were areas in which I needed to consult on various manufacturing tasks and operational roles and operational tasks. And time and again, it was irrespective of the scenario, it was the same type of situation. Looking at data and understanding exactly what the situation was, and using the data that was available to draw insights and make various types of suggestions or draw opinions on how to optimize a particular process within a supply chain. So the consulting world was great, and slowly but surely, consulting and academia are very interesting relationship, right? Because on one side you're wearing multiple hats and working with multiple different customers, and on another side you're understanding the theory and the concepts. And I was always drawn to academia. So I think it was 2013. I got a call from Harvard asking me to develop a course in supply chain, and it's continued on. It's gone on for more than 10 years now, and it's fantastic because that opened my eyes to how supply chain management as a theoretical and conceptual and academic platform is changing extraordinarily quickly. And that same process, kept on going with Michigan State and some of the other academic appointments that I've held, which is fascinating because if you look at other areas like perhaps mathematics or statistics, it's kind of a discipline that largely stays the same, I would expect, in many cases. But if you look at operations or you look at supply chain, there is the need to continually evolve, not just in industry and in practice, but also in academia, which I found absolutely fascinating. So in that regard, my core strengths and the areas that I enjoy doing, which is analyzing and developing business strategies, have applied throughout in my PhD and my industry work and my consulting work, and then most certainly in my work as an academic.
It's interesting when you describe the various roles and responsibilities that supply chain professionals have taken on, not only in the organization, but outside the organization in terms of relationships. Do you think there's still misconceptions about people, and what they have about the supply chain professional and the role that supply chain managers have?
I'll tell you a funny story. I went to undergrad at Windsor, and then I did an MBA in Detroit. And so that the Windsor Detroit area has always been kind of near and dear to my heart. And after entering supply chain or teaching supply chain, working at Procter and Gamble and doing whatever, I used to drive through that corridor and I used to cross the border. And inevitably, a border guard would ask, what do you do? And I'd say, I'm a professor. And they'd say, what do you teach? An interrogatory kind of question. And I'd say supply chain. And immediately the conversation would change. And the reason for why is because, everyone had heard of what a supply chain was, but very few people actually knew, properly what a supply chain meant. And I would say that kind of, continued until relatively recently. When President Biden, used the term supply chain in various forms of media when it became publicized because of COVID-19. So as a result of kind of a crisis with COVID-19 and supply chains all across the world being compromised and negatively impacted, the supply chain term all of a sudden arose from the dust to become something that people recognized and were somewhat familiar with. So it's an interesting twist, but that's I suppose how it goes.
Yeah, and it's still evolving as we sit here today. Let's dig into the academic side a little bit. Do you see a gap between what's taught in the classrooms today and what's needed in the industry?
The gap that I believe might exist is that few students, and I say few, and that's relative, understand how they're going to translate what they're learning
Yeah.
into application into industry. And here's what I mean. If someone goes to Windsor, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, whichever university they choose to go to, and they take an accounting course, they know that there's a pathway that would
Yeah.
potentially lead them to becoming an accountant. When you take a supply chain course, and supply chain as a focus and as a discipline, um, despite there being tremendous programs, MSU's program, for example, Harvard's program, absolutely phenomenal
Mhm.
professors and an education stream. I'm not sure that it is a clear path. Right now, there are a number of different options that students have. Some students are interested in perhaps going into packaging areas
Yeah.
or manufacturing areas or procurement, or so there's a number of different. So I think the academic atmosphere and environment does a good job in explaining or in ensuring that the mindset is clear and that the tools are necessary.
Mhm.
Perhaps if there is a gap, it would be connecting the dots in terms of exactly which career might be a
Yeah.
good fit for certain areas of coursework. And that's difficult to do from a number of different perspectives. One is because, academically, you need to keep things a little bit broad to make sure that students are, not pigeonholing themselves. And two is that the needs of a supply chain are so consistently evolving and constantly changing that
Mhm.
a tool that's learned needs to be applied in a number of different ways, as things progress. So those are the challenges. Some of the institutions and universities are doing a phenomenal job. MSU is one, Harvard's another. They're doing a great job of doing exactly that. In general, I would say if there is one area to focus on, it might be that
It's interesting when you talk about, sort of the expectations of an individual coming into school and what their career trajectory looks like. I always bemoan the fact that we did not have a clear path into what a CSCO's, job looked like because of the multiple entry points. As you indicated, you can come in through warehousing, you can come through production, you can come through logistics. There's a variety of different, avenues there, but yet at the end of the day, you need to encompass all of those skills to truly have an understanding of the role and responsibility. We've often heard from employers that the students coming out of school today may be overweighted on technology and analytics and underweighted on real world experience and problem solving. We tend to have an over reliance on technology because it's a system that crunches the data that you were studying in school much faster and much greater volumes. Give me a sense of the balance that needs to be struck between the technology and the critical problem solving skills that people need to have.
And it's interesting. I came from a background of computer science in which programming was. I remember one semester at Windsor, I had to learn, I think, 4 different programming languages simultaneously. And now I look back and I ask myself, if I wanted to, code something, would I do it? Sure, I could do it, but there's so many quicker and faster and more efficient ways to get it done, right? I mean, in a previous, time period, if we reversed, let's say 10 years ago, you could connect with people who could code and in other parts of the world, and have a project put together without needing to sit on a computer and do it yourself. Now it's gotten even further, and that was just with AI tools, for example, and various other areas. And that's just in one segment with computer science. Now if we traverse that and we look at areas of operations and supply chain, it becomes perhaps even more interesting, because in many of the many areas of coursework, students learn how to develop a formula, how to use a statistical algorithm, how to optimize numerical values based on. Um, it's very important, but the actual act of calculating something, I wouldn't necessarily say is as important as understanding what it's actually doing, what the meaning of that data is. Now, I will say this: it's interesting because as far back, I was I used to teach at USC in the Marshall School of Business. I was a professor there
Mhm.
for several years, from going all the way back to I think 2013 or 2014, and that logic was still applied. And the reason for why I say this is because exams you didn't have to memorize formulas. You were given a formula sheet, you were given a crib sheet that you could bring into an exam. So there was the recognition of the fact that the importance lies on understanding the data, or understanding the information, understanding the output, to be able to make decisions, as opposed to memorizing a formula. And that evolution is extraordinarily important. Now that we're moving into the next stage with even more advanced tools like artificial intelligence and a variety of other tools that can be used to generate insight, it's even more important to stick to the initial framework and the initial vision of being able to recognize and understand and interpret and make decisions based on information, not memorize a formula.
Yeah, it's the dangerous combination when you're overweighted on technology and underweighted on critical thinking. You accept everything that comes out of the system without applying your heuristics, your experience to it. So I think there's been a learning curve that it needs to be addressed here. Give me a sense of the expectations of the students coming into the program. Have you seen a change, or is it pretty consistent in terms of what they expect when they get into the field?
Well, it depends on the university. Interestingly enough,
Mhm.
different student bodies have different perspectives, and I will tell you this: in general, if I'm looking at things from a large from a bird's eye view, years ago, supply chain management was a topic that someone would want to take if they knew what a supply chain was, and if their parent or a sibling worked in a supply chain field or a supply chain area or for manufacturing. They knew what a supply chain was and they were interested in it. It wasn't necessarily that, they saw opportunity per se, great opportunities. They just were interested in that topic and that was their field of choice. Right now, when you look at it, and you kind of look adjacent to that, and you look at operations management, then
Mhm.
you get people who realized that the operational efficiency and optimization of an organization is extraordinarily important. So they could recognize the importance, and that was why they,
Mhm.
focused on it, and also to develop, mathematical or analytical skills in addition to just understanding how business works. Fast forward 10 years past, and in current day, I would say that now all of a sudden we are seeing a steady rise of students who might not necessarily have a background in supply chain management.
Mhm.
They know what a supply chain is,
Yeah.
and the difference is now they're interested in understanding about supply chains, not because they see, potential income, that too, but more so because they see potential opportunity and they actually recognize the value under this, umbrella term of supply chain being applied in academia as well as in business.
It's interesting. We always, to focus on the path to leadership within an organization, that you had to have that broad-based knowledge and understanding of all the activities in an organization. Historically, it's been two functions. Either the CFO or the chief supply chain officer have to know everything that goes on in the organization. We've trained CFOs to be those transformational leaders in organizations. We necessarily haven't trained our supply chain professionals to be transformative leaders. We've advocated for years to have a seat at the table. Our supply chain professionals prepared to use their voice when they have a seat at the table. And I think that's the question that we have today. Are we prepared to lead in today's environment with the content and the capabilities and experience that supply chain professionals have today?
Most people will recognize a specific set of titles on the
Mhm.
executive tier.
Yeah.
A CEO will be immediately recognized, a
Mhm.
CFO,
Yeah.
right? A COO, Chief Operating Officer. And then you'll have, some of the others like Chief Marketing Officer, and depending on the company, a variety of other C-suite positions.
Mhm.
And for the longest time, the role of supply chain has basically fallen through the cracks, right? And it's been covered by the COO role in
Yeah.
operations, and perhaps the CFO role from a financial perspective, and then perhaps the CEO role from a strategic vision, right? And so, when you say you're a supply chain manager, if you look at the hierarchical chart, it's not
Yeah.
necessarily a clear line as to where you report, right? And that's been the case for, forever.
Yeah.
It's very interesting because things are changing, and we are seeing that the evolution of a chief supply chain management officer, a chief supply chain officer, right, which is extraordinarily important because bridging those gaps in terms of what can be done financially, what should be done strategically, and what is being done operationally into one role and optimizing it on each side is exactly where I've seen the chief supply chain officer's role fit. And I think it's incredibly important for the continued progression of business overall.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's one of the things that we're, taking a look at is also, the type of leadership that we're seeing right now within supply chain. You referenced before the majority of individuals that you taught a number of years ago came out of engineering or finance, the business degrees. And now we're seeing a lot of, a much more diverse workforce coming into the field today. Engineering and finance back in the 80s and 90s, predominantly white male industries. And yet the diversity right now is significantly different. So we may have a generational gap between what the leadership is today and the diversity that's coming into the marketplace right now. Are we prepared for that generational shift in terms of role responsibilities and giving women and people of color opportunities within supply chain today?
I think we certainly should be, and I think we are doing ourselves a disservice if we don't. Now, when I say that, what I mean is that there should be um, attention put to the fact that people from different backgrounds, coming from different roles, exposed to different industries, have a a wealth of knowledge that they can share. Um, and I recall my time at P&G, since we're talking about that here, and how it shaped certain areas of thinking. P&G, graduates from various universities were chosen not based on anything else, but based on the program itself, and ensuring that it was aligned with P&G's values.
Mhm.
It was a very centralized structure. It wasn't necessarily just a hiring manager wanted to choose someone from their alma mater and they could hire them. No, it was extraordinarily centralized, to the point where I remember having to write a personality test to come in, having to write a math test, having 3 rounds of interviews to get a job at P&G. And the reason for why is because it was designed to ensure that there was diversity, but also that those core values were maintained. So if you look at, you know, people coming in from arts backgrounds, or
Mhm.
management backgrounds, or engineering backgrounds, or science backgrounds, or medical backgrounds, and you see the way their minds think and the exposure that they've had to varieties of different industries, fields, and experiences, it makes for a very, very strong pool of talent that can be used in the supply chain.
Yeah, let me shift a little bit on the role responsibility, because we talked about sort of the evolving role of the chief supply chain officer, but really all the team members within the supply chain right now, and the focus on visibility, transparency, and traceability. You've often spoke about that gap that we have today in terms of what companies are truly getting in terms of what they need to do for transparency and traceability. These were not part of the supply chain professionals' role responsibility even 8, 9 years ago, and now squarely within our role and responsibilities. Are companies truly getting at it, or is it still a little bit further down the horizon in terms of really, getting true visibility and transparency within their supply chains?
You look at the majority of companies that are large companies, and majority of companies that are, let's say, companies that have a lot of employees. And typically, those companies tend to move a little bit slower. It's like a large ocean liner, kind of moving. It moves, as opposed to, startup companies that may have, 10 people working at them, and they're like a jet ski, right? They can kind of maneuver as they need to, and move as they need to. So when you evaluate the role of um, of supply chain leadership within an organization, it's important to understand the role of innovation, and the level of commitment that companies have to innovation. I've worked with a number of companies that have had the attitude that this is the way things are done, and this is the way things are going to continue being done. And then, Procter and Gamble, which is a massive company who went out of their way to make sure that they were being as innovative as they possibly could,
Yeah.
right? So the reason for why I say that is because it is often a situation in which, with a supply chain continually evolving, and there needing to be that connection between finance and strategy, and a number of different areas, operations, to design how a supply chain is going to work. It is extraordinarily important to understand that that evolution needs to be embraced, not not shied away from. Not necessarily just in terms of new products, but also in terms of innovation for products, in terms of understanding consumer markets, in terms of understanding distribution models, and the list goes on. One of the more interesting things, I think, in terms of supply chain evolution, especially within industry, is the continual um, availability of new tools that
Yeah.
have allowed supply chain professionals to essentially do their jobs better, and to gain much more insight than they would have in a previous generation. I mean, just in terms of understanding consumer behavioral patterns, and understanding, and access to certain forms of data. It's extraordinary to see how things have evolved and changed.
It's interesting. You talked before about your the foundation of data within your career in analytics. There's a lot of buzz today about AI. I mean, if you put AI in front of anything right now, it is, oh, what's the latest buzz on this? From your perspective, what's hype and what's truly transformational? Is this the shiny new object that we're all focused on, or is this really a game changer?
That's an interesting question again, because if you look, back, what are we in 2025 now? I think back in maybe 2013, thereabouts, 3D printing was supposed to
Yeah.
completely revolutionize how the world worked, right? If we
Then
reverse back even
blockchain came
further,
in, yeah.
blockchain, right? If we reverse even further, the internet, and these new innovations have most definitely revolutionized the way work goes and business moves. It's that's beyond contestation. But if we look now at artificial intelligence, um, what what interests me is the pace at which AI is moving, and how new innovations and new uh, achievements, if you will, from AI modeling are coming through. So whether this is going to be the shining star and the one size fits all solution to every problem that we have, I don't know. But I will say this: the ability that AI has to analyze data is far and head and shoulders above what we could have done in a previous generation. And the fact that it's able to analyze data to help us with demand forecasting, analyze data to help us with various trends in terms of projections, in terms of product development cycles, in terms of a variety of different areas that would speak to the supply chain field specifically. Right? If you told someone in accounting what demand projection was in terms of this deviation in this EOQ, they might be they might look at you, but within a supply chain area, to see that these areas are being focused upon, and that AI is instrumental in optimizing our findings and our ability to draw conclusions is rather eye-opening. Where it will go and how it'll evolve, that's a big question mark. But I definitely do believe that there is a substantial amount of value in what's transforming now and what's taking place.
Zal, you mentioned before about responding to those demand signals and that consumer buying or triggering the supply chain and everything behind it. Do you think most consumers really understand the power that they have, or is this still I feel disconnected from the supply chain today? So it doesn't matter what I do, and it doesn't matter what I buy.
I think that's interesting, because I think it depends on the geography. And I say this from, my exposure. So I'm not necessarily
Mhm.
looking at data or statistics, but I know when I walk into a store in South Africa, for example, I'm South African. Um, it it's not uncommon for the manager at the store to say, "Look, we're out of stock. We don't have inventory." That's that. If something is purchased from a store in South Africa, it's not uncommon to see a complete uproar in terms of if the product doesn't meet its needs, or if someone's unhappy with what they've purchased. And if you compare that to some of the other countries I've lived in, Canada and the US, the behavioral patterns are different. Okay, so that's from the perspective of consumer advocacy and perhaps consumer perception. If we look even further into how consumers actually behave and consumer behavioral patterns, and the enormous impact that that has on supply chains, the simple answer is no. I don't believe consumers know the power that they yield, and that they have. Um, and we've seen this in a number of different areas in which consumers have extraordinary power. One of the popular examples is in popular cases is the Blockbuster example, which I'm sure you've heard a zillion times, in which right, Blockbuster was supposed to have bought Netflix and they didn't, and then they went out of business.
Yeah.
And the list goes on in terms of all of these examples. But it's rare that we draw that line and we say to ourselves, why exactly did these companies fail, or why did they succeed? It wasn't because of a tremendous business strategy. Sure, it was, but at the root of it all, it was because consumers were, persuaded or incentivized or satisfied with a solution that they didn't have before, and so they migrated from one to the next, and as a result, things changed. That's core to a supply chain. So consumers should definitely realize how much power they hold. Whether they do or not is a big question mark, and I include myself in that same mix.
So, Zal, talking to a young professional, what's one piece of advice you would give them entering the field right now? What's at the top of the list for you in terms of somebody coming into the field?
My advice has always been the same, and it draws on my experience and my exposure. When I first came in, when I was a graduate, or even before that, I went into Windsor, a very competitive computer science program, thinking that I was going to be a computer scientist. Within the first 2 weeks, I was overwhelmed by the talent pool that existed in a computer science. And I know I had no idea what to do. I wasn't used to being not at the top of the pile. And I thought to myself, now I need to make a transition. Somehow or the other, I made it through. And at the end of it all, I said, okay, well, computer science and programming isn't my forte, but analytics is. So
Yeah.
I went and I did an MBA. And at the end of the MBA, I was convinced that that my calling in life was marketing. And so I went out and I found a great job right out of my MBA, and worked in marketing, which required analytics and required various different marketing decisions and strategies and whatnot for a year and a half. And I remember, by the sixth day, I hated life. I really didn't want to be there. It was the worst thing that I'd done. So I stuck it out for another year and a half, and then I went into P&G, and everything clicked. So my advice to people who are entering the field and coming out of university has always been the same. Embrace change.
Yeah.
Embrace the fact that what you choose at one stage of your life, which works for you, is not necessarily going to be the same thing that works for you, um, you know, 10 years or 20 years down the line. I seem to see this statement. I seem to be, quite reassured in the statement, because I've looked at, colleagues who have gone out of their way to change and to grow and to take leaps and risks, and they've done phenomenal,
Mhm.
work in their careers. And they've achieved, great things. And so it's always kind of driven me to, push myself further in terms of, going into the unknown. So that's always been my advice for new grads. Always embrace the unknown, and realize that there's a very strong chance that where you start is not necessarily going to be where you end
No,
up.
really, really keen advice in terms of the multiple skill sets that are required to be successful in today's environment and from an individual. All right, let me flip it now. From the company side, what should supply chain leaders and companies do to nurture the next generation of those change makers in their organization? What do they need to focus on?
Very good question. And this is a tough pill to swallow. I have an opinion here, and that opinion is, you need to understand that an employee is the goal of an employee is not to serve a company for the rest of their lives. It's to grow individually. And so if you are wanting to retain employees, what you need to do is you need to make sure that you are meeting the needs of the employee. If you are wanting to grow as a company and retain talent and innovation, then you need to be okay with not necessarily keeping the same employees, growing as you grow and changing employees based on what your needs are. This is somewhat of a controversial opinion that I hold, very true, because I don't, necessarily believe that every single person is cut out from the exact same thread, right? And my time at P&G, again, getting back to P&G, kind of applies here. I think the statistics were unbelievable. It was, I think, 100 or 300 or something unusually high applicants came in every day, and they weeded the hiring group each year to about 30 people. And those 30 people were the people who they had, assumed would be employees for 20 years down the line,
Wow.
because they met all of P&G's core values. Now,
Yeah.
in some cases, they were bang on. And I remember working with people who had been there for 25 years, and they, would say that the person who they're working with was in their class in university, and grew up with them, et cetera, et cetera. And for other classes, it was absolutely wrong, right? They got the algorithm completely wrong, and people decided to go their own way and move from one company to the next. So it's interesting, because companies need to decide, how much of an investment are they going to make in training? How much of an investment are they
Yeah.
going to make in recruitment? And are they going to nurture an employee throughout their entire career and change the company based on the needs of the company or the needs of the employee, or vice versa? And oftentimes that's an uneasy conversation to have.
But again, I think it demonstrates the commitment that organizations need to have to the individuals in growing that skill set. And then more importantly, for the individual to understand, you can't stand still with your education today, that the evolving role and responsibility of supply chain professionals is moving at exponential speeds today versus where we were, even 5 to 10 years ago. Zal, thank you so much for highlighting, not only what we need to prepare for the next generation of supply chain professionals, but how companies can nurture those individuals, those real superheroes in those organizations. Thank you so much, Zal.
It's been such a pleasure, Abe. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the time today. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you very, very much.
All the best.